Summary of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. In The Color of Law, historian Richard Rothstein says that every American city is segregated by race. He argues that this segregation is de jure, not de facto, because it is the result of systemic and forceful government action, and that the government has a constitutional as well as a moral obligation to fix it. Residential racial segregation is planned and carried out by all levels of the American government. It keeps African Americans poor and weak by keeping them in ghettos and preventing them from owning their own homes. And this kind of separation is still going on in the 21st century. Residential segregation is harder to fix than things like denying African Americans the right to vote, public services, and equal legal security. This is because residential segregation is about where and how people live their lives. Even worse, American governments, banks, and the real estate industry continue to intentionally segregate cities, which hurts African Americans. Rothstein traces the past of this problem in the 20th century in The Color of Law and explains what the American people and government need to do in this century to fix it. In Chapter 1, Rothstein uses the story of Frank Stevenson, an African American man who lived in Richmond, California in the middle of the 20th century, to show how de jure racism is a problem. Richmond was a town that used to make things, and it grew quickly during World War II. To keep up with demand, the government built public housing. For white people, they built a comfortable suburb called Rollingwood. But for black working families, they built poorly constructed apartments in industrial neighborhoods or just left them to live on the street. Stevenson worked at a Ford Motor plant. After the war, the factory was moved to Milpitas, which is an hour away. Stevenson was out of luck because black people couldn't live in Milpitas. Federal Housing Administration, FHA, funds were only given to all white neighborhoods, so while housing options grew for white people in places like Milpitas, no one built homes for African Americans. So, black people were only allowed to live in certain neighborhoods, and over time, those neighborhoods became completely black. After that, the government stopped providing services to these black neighborhoods, which turned them into the slums they are today. Rothstein then gives each way the government has tried to divide America over time its own chapter. In Chapter 2, he talks about public housing. During Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, the government started building a lot of it. Under these social programs of the 1930s, the government only built white homes in white neighborhoods and black homes in black neighborhoods. All over the United States, the federal government's housing programs tore down mixed-race neighborhoods and built separate housing in their place. From the 1950s on, as white residents gradually left for the suburbs, helped by federal mortgage safeguards that only helped them, African Americans became the main people who lived in public housing. Now, almost all new public housing is built in neighborhoods where most of the people are black. In Chapter 3, Rothstein shows how block by block, zoning rules have been used to divide American cities. In the 1910s, towns came up with a lot of creative ways to stop white families from buying on African American dominated blocks and vice versa. Even though the Supreme Court made this illegal in 1917, cities kept doing it for more than 50 years by using sneakier methods, such as making it illegal to build apartments in white neighborhoods and zoning African American neighborhoods for industrial or toxic waste development. Rothstein talks about how the government kept wealthy African Americans from moving to white suburbs in Chapter 4. As with state housing, the New Deal was the first time that people could really buy their own home. Roosevelt's government started giving out a new kind of loan that middle-class Americans could afford. This made property a way for white people to move up into the middle class, but not for black people. Roosevelt's government put up red lines around African American neighborhoods and refused to give loans or cover bank mortgages to anyone who lived there. But Rothstein points out that loan limits weren't the only thing that kept middle-class African Americans from moving to the suburbs. In Chapter 5, he tells the story of restrictive covenants, which were parts of contracts that said a property couldn't be sold to a non-white person. With the help of the Federal Housing Administration, builders, homeowners, and homeowners groups used these rules to keep neighborhoods separate. In fact, the FHA kept pushing these covenants even after the Supreme Court said in 1948 that they were against the Constitution. In Chapter 6, Rothstein looks at the real reason for all of this policy, the idea that if African Americans moved into a neighborhood, the value of the white-owned properties there would go down. This claim is not only untrue, but all studies show the opposite. Because of segregation and discrimination, African Americans have always had to pay more than white people for the same housing, and when they move into a neighborhood, they actually raise property values. In fact, this is what made the shady practice of blockbusting work. Estate agents scared white homeowners with racist threats of a Negro invasion, bought their homes for cheap, and then sold the same homes to African Americans for more money, often using a predatory contract sale system. Rothstein talks about how the tax system enforces segregation in Chapter 7. For example, for a century, the IRS has given tax-exempt status to segregationist churches and colleges and has done nothing to stop banks and insurance companies from being racist. This is still going on in the 21st century. The main reason the economy crashed in 2008 was because banks gave bad subprime loans to poor Americans, and government probes have shown that banks specifically targeted black buyers. Rothstein shows in Chapter 8 what local governments can do to stop integration. He goes back to Milpitas, California, where in the 1950s people worked hard for several years to build an integrated suburb for Ford Motor workers. Landowners, other builders, and the local government caused delays, legal fees, and financing problems for the neighborhood. This made it too expensive to build. This is a familiar story. Local governments in the U.S. have used extraordinary creativity to keep African Americans out for a long time. In the past, local governments have turned planned black neighborhoods into parks, built motorways through them, or, in segregated southern states, shut down all public services for black people in all but a small part of town. Rothstein looks at the role of state-sanctioned violence in efforts to stop people from integrating in Chapter 9. From the 1950s to the 1980s, angry white people often camped out on the lawns of black people who came into their neighborhoods. Many black families' homes were burned down, and the cops either sided with the mobs or didn't help the people who asked for help. In many cases, black people who owned their own homes were caught and punished themselves. In Chapter 10, Rothstein explains why many black people can't move to white neighborhoods because they can't afford to. This is also the result of the policy. For example, the government kept African Americans from getting jobs in the decades after slavery, kept them out of the New Deal and post-World War II work programs, and didn't enforce non-discrimination rules against racist companies and labor unions. African Americans often pay several times as much in property taxes as the law says they should because local governments always charge them more than they should. And housing has always been too expensive in African American ghettos. Landlords knew that black renters would pay several times more in rent than white tenants throughout the 20th century. Rothstein asks in Chapter 11 what it would take to deal with housing segregation now, which will be hard because it requires undoing past actions. Even though the Fair Housing Act of 1968 removed all formal barriers to integration, the United States is still just as segregated as it was before, and it is still very hard for African Americans, in particular, to move into the middle class. A few other things make this problem worse. In white neighborhoods, homes go up in value more quickly, and most white families bought their first homes before 1973 when most Americans' wages stopped going up. Now, new public housing is still being built in the poorest and most segregated neighborhoods, and government programs like Section 8 housing choice vouchers make these neighborhoods even more isolated instead of helping people move into middle-class areas. Rothstein asks in Chapter 12 what can be done right now to stop home segregation. He says that most Americans are too scared or cynical to face the past, but that integration can still be pushed for. He talks about easy ways to make things better, like changing texts that are wrong and actually following the Fair Housing Act. Then, he makes some specific policy suggestions. For example, the government could sell African Americans homes at lower prices to make up for what they lost because of segregation. It could also encourage real estate agents to help integrate neighborhoods, limit localities' zoning powers, and stop giving all white neighborhoods tax breaks to get them to mix. In fact, some towns have already made some small changes to their public housing voucher programs and seen the benefits of integration in certain neighborhoods. In the last part of the book, called the Epilogue, Rothstein says that even the Supreme Court got American history horribly wrong when it said that residential segregation was not caused by the government but by private choices. He comes to the conclusion that this comfortable delusion is no longer possible, and he lists all the very bad things that have happened because the government actively segregated the U.S.
About the author. Even though The Color of Law is what most people know Richard Rothstein for now, he spent most of his long career as a scholar studying education policy and school segregation. In the 2000s and 2010s, he changed his focus to studying housing discrimination because he realized that the main reason American schools are still separated is because American neighborhoods are so segregated. In the beginning of his work, Rothstein taught for a few years at Columbia and Harvard universities. From 1999 to 2002, he also wrote a column for the New York Times about education issues. Rothstein is connected to a number of universities, think tanks, and civil rights groups such as the Economic Policy Institute, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Othering and Belonging Institute, formerly the Haas Institute, at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. In 2015, the Bank Street College of Education gave him an honorary doctorate, and his son, Jesse Rothstein, is also a professor who focuses on education problems.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.